Hi, in this video we're going to give you an overview and demonstration of the VirtualBox virtualization software that you could run on your desktop computer. So this is made by Oracle and it's free to use. You could run it on Windows, Linux, and I believe macOS as well. So once you download it and install it, you'll have your Oracle VirtualBox Manager. This is where you manage and create all your virtual machines and also manage things like your storage and networking. So this will be blank when you first start, and then once you start creating virtual machines, you will see them in here. So you can see I have several already created, and this one here is actually running. And then as you select them, you could see the configuration, 8 gigs of RAM, 2 processors, the boot order, how much video memory is assigned to it, networking, USB, shared folders, and so on. And then since it's running, we see a little preview there, or for this one, we don't because it's not running. And then I have the console open here, so you could run this console on a separate window here. And of course, you could remote desktop into it if you have that configured, or use something like VNC. So this is the console screen for this virtual machine. It's running Windows 11, and you'll have your menus up here. Preferences for the VirtualBox itself. So this is not preferences for the virtual machine. This is for VirtualBox itself, so I'm not sure why they put it on the console screen. So then you have your machine options here, your settings. So under the general settings, you have the name of the VM, what it's running, the snapshot folder if you're using snapshots, description if you add one, encryption if you're using it. So you have your system information here. So this is using 8 gigs of RAM, and this host computer has 64 gigs of memory on it, so I could actually use quite a bit of memory on this computer. So it has this boot order here configured. And then since this is running Windows 11, it has the TPM installed on it. And here's the processor information, 2 processors, and then hardware acceleration enabled by default. Display settings, it's always good to bump this up all the way. How many monitors you have, you could use multiple monitors with VirtualBox. And the graphics controller, they have a couple different ones you could choose from. And then storage. So here's the virtual hard disk associated with it. Here's the location. So I have my VirtualBox VMs in this folder here. So of course the disks and virtual machine configuration files, they could take up a lot of space. So if you have a secondary drive, it might be a good idea to put it in there. So if I check the properties here, I have 152 gigabytes worth of virtual machine files on this computer just for these VMs here. Then you have your virtual DVD. So if you want to mount an ISO file for installing an operating system or booting to something else, or even just to install something, you can do that. And here's a secondary drive that I have on here. It's just a little drive that I was doing with some testing. And here's the controller. So if you want to edit these settings, in this situation, you'll need to shut down the VM. There are a few settings you could edit while it's on, but to add hard drives or configure stuff, you'll have to turn it off. Audio settings, so it'll share the audio with your host computer. Network settings, so the default is to use NAT, Network Address Translation, so it'll share the internet connection with your host computer. And you could choose one of these other types if you have them configured. Some advanced options here for the MAC address. You could actually change the MAC address on a VM in VirtualBox. And then you could have other adapters as well. If you have a need for serial ports, you could add one of those. USB controllers, so you could share USB devices on your host with the virtual machine if you need to do that. And you could also set up shared folders between the host and the virtual machine, so that way if you need to copy files, you could do that. And then user interface options for the menus and so on, you could kind of change that configuration if you want. All right, then also up here we have snapshots. So if you want to take a snapshot, which is actually, it'll capture the state of the virtual machine, what's in memory, what's running, and so on, what's on the hard drive. And that way if you need to revert back to it, so if you want to maybe make some serious changes, and in case something goes wrong, you could revert back to that snapshot, but just keep in mind that anything you do after the snapshot was made, if you revert back, all those changes will be lost. Session information, if you want to see what's going on there. File manager, show the log, pause, reset, shut down. So VirtualBox allows you to install the guest additions tools, which will allow things like, being able to move the mouse in and out of the console without having to press special keys, or shut the VM down properly if needed, and that type of thing. You want to change the modes here, full screen, adjust the window as you drag, and so on. Keyboard, so if you want to insert a command, Control-Alt-Delete, because if you press that on the host, it's going to apply it to the host, so this way you can send a Control-Alt-Delete to the VM itself. And then another way to see your optical drives here, and your audio, network, and then you could, a quick way to get to the settings if needed. Shared folders if you're using it. Shared clipboard, which is disabled here. So that's something you probably want to turn on. So you can copy and paste between the VM and the host. Drag and drop, disable too, something you might want to enable so you can drag and drop files between them. And then, of course, you can insert the CD if you want to upgrade the guest additions tools. Then you also have your status bar down here, which kind of shows what's going on with the drives. No USB drives attached. Here's the shared folder, video memory. You could actually do recording, a processor, mouse information, and so on. Okay, so let's go back to the main VirtualBox Manager. Up here you have some preferences. Like you could change the default location for new virtual machines if you want to do that. Input for shortcuts, you could change that or add them. Check for updates, language, maximum guest size if you want to put a restriction on it, you could do that. Probably a good idea to leave it at none. Proxy information, which you're probably not using, and then themes if you want to do dark mode and so on. Then you could also import an appliance of something you could download for some extra functionality, or do an export of a virtual machine. And you have some tools here. It has extension packs for additional functionality if you want to read up on that. Virtual Media Manager. So this will show your hard drives, your optical disks. So I have some optical disks that are not attached, so they could have been moved. So I could also remove them from here if I want. And then floppy disks if you have a need for that. So you could add an existing virtual hard drive to a VM if you have one from another computer. You could detach it and then add it to another one and get to the files via the operating system in the guest OS. You could create a new hard drive, which would be a virtual disk file from here. You could also do it from the virtual machine itself. Copy and move virtual disks, release them from virtual machines, and so on. Then we have the Network Manager. So this has a host-only network configured. So if you go to NAT networks, there is a default NAT network configured. It doesn't show up here. This is if you want to make an additional network. Then it has some cloud network options here, which you may or may not use. And of course, you can check the properties here for IP addresses, DHCP settings. If you want to set the upper and lower bounds here to change what they have on the default here, disable DHCP if you want. Remove it, create a new one. Cloud profile, we won't go into that because that's something you most likely won't use. VM activity, if you want to see what's going on with the virtual machine. Then you can add or remove columns as needed. Check for updates, reset warnings. So if we go back to the virtual machine list, we will have a machine option when we click on one of them. If we wanted to go back to the settings again, export it, show it, which will just open the console, pause, reset, stop. Check the details, look at the snapshots, look at the logs, file manager, show and explore if you want to see the files, create a shortcut to it, and actually search if you have a lot of VMs. All right, and then if you have a VirtualBox VM that's already configured but not added to your inventory, you could add it from here. You just have to browse to the appropriate file to import it into your existing virtual machines. And then, of course, to do a new virtual machine, let's kind of go through this real quick. So test, here's my default location. Then you could browse to an ISO image. Let's say Windows 11, 23H2. And you can see it detects it. And you could do an unattended installation where it'll kind of enter the information for you. I don't like to do that. It doesn't seem to work too well. Then, of course, you have the expert mode if you want to kind of do things yourself, which is what I like to do. So here's the unattended install if you want to put in a product key and a password and so on. So then we're going to have to choose the ISO file again here. Now you can see it detected Windows 11. Hardware, it will kind of give you some suggestions based on the ISO file you're using, so you can bump this up and down if you like. Hard disk options, so it'll create a disk file based on the name of the virtual machine, which was test in my case. Then you could change the size if you want to make it bigger or smaller than what they have here. Just make sure you give it enough room for the operating system and anything you want to install afterwards. Then you can pick your disk type. So they recommend a VirtualBox disk image for the default there. And if you want to have it take up the full size, you could check this box. Otherwise, it'll be dynamically expanding. And then what that means is it'll just use the space on your host as needed. So if I make an 80 gig drive, it might only take up 20 after I install Windows. And then it's only going to use 20 gigs on my host instead of the whole 80. And then when it gets to that 80 gigs in the guest operating system, then it'll be maxed out. And then, of course, you could use an existing virtual hard disk if you have one, or do not add one. And then you can see up here, we got a little message because I can't continue. I got to put the name back in there. And you click on Finish. And now it's going to start it up automatically in this case. Press any key to boot from CD. And you can see here, since I used the unattended installation, it couldn't read the product key because I didn't put one in there. All right, so I'm just going to kill this for now. I'm going to power off the VM. You could save the state if you want, or send the shutdown signal to shut it down properly, but this is just test, so I'm just going to kill it. And let's say I don't want this VM. I could right-click on it, click on Remove. So I could remove it from the inventory. It'll leave the files, or I could delete all the files. So I don't want the files for this since it was just a test. So I'm going to delete all files, and that'll remove the files off my host. All right, so as you can see, there's a lot you could do with it, even though it's not super complicated. But once you get everything down and figure out how to make the VMs and manage them, it's actually pretty easy to use. All right, so I'll put a link in the description for the VirtualBox website, and then you could try it out for yourself. All right, thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe.